Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and thanks so much for joining me today for another art video. In today's video, I'm going to be walking you through how I paint a sliced avocado using watercolor. I would consider this step-by-step tutorial to be great for beginners getting started with this tricky medium. It'll be an awesome opportunity to continue practicing our water control, our color mixing, the development of a more believable sensation of 3D form, and I'm going to be sharing some techniques that I frequently like using for my own paintings. Alright, so without much further ado, let's go ahead and jump straight into it. So what you're seeing me work on right now is my preliminary outline sketch. Before getting started with my painting process, I am using an HB pencil, and as you can see, I am drawing pretty light, and this is because I don't want my pencil work to show through my translucent paint at the end because watercolor is transparent, and of course also because I want to be able to erase my mistakes. The lighter you draw, the more easily you're able to erase your mistakes along the way. And finally, it's important because you don't want to scratch or damage your watercolor paper as you're drawing. As always, I started sketching the largest shapes first, and I made my way towards the smaller shapes and details after those largest general shapes were effectively placed in my drawing area. I also mapped out main highlights as well as darkest dark areas for myself with my graphite pencil before getting started with my painting process. It's always super important that you take a moment to observe your reference photo or whatever it is you have in front of you in real life and notice areas of darkest darks, of midtones and lightest lights, especially when you're going for mid to higher levels of realism. All right, so with my preliminary pencil sketch out of the way, I get started with creating my different color mixtures that I'm going to be using for the different parts of the avocado, as well as the cast shadow beneath it. These 5 colors that I chose for this little study are all from my St. Petersburg White Nights watercolor paint set. The specific colors that I chose are raw sienna, burnt sienna, Indian yellow, sap green, and indigo. I also want to make sure to mention that for this one, it's very important that you choose watercolor paper that allows you to do layering, because we're going to be doing layers today. We're going to be allowing that previous layer to dry completely and then coming back in and darkening certain areas on top of it or just adding more detail. And it's very important that you use an appropriate paper that allows for this, because I've definitely used papers in the past that have made the layering process or creating washes on top of previous layers very aggravating, because even after that layer has completely dried and completely settled into the paper, it easily reactivates when you start working on top of it, and your different values that you've created all start merging together and it just doesn't work. All right, so having said all that, I first created 3 different green color mixtures for myself, and all of these are nice, juicy color mixtures. They have quite a bit of color in them, but a bit of water as well. And I first got started with creating 3 different greens. The first one is a lighter green. It has sap green and plenty of Indian yellow to lighten it up. I then created a medium green by mixing together also my sap green and my Indian yellow, but that one had more sap green in it than Indian yellow. And then finally I created a third green, and that was plain sap green with some water in it. As I'm working on my color mixtures, I am swatching the color out on a scrap piece of watercolor paper because I want to make sure that the colors will work well together before actually using them in my painting. So the next set of colors that I am going to be creating for myself are the browns that I'm going to be using in the seed of the avocado. So same as with the greens, I want to set myself up for success and make sure that I am creating a few different browns, a lighter brown, which in this case, it's a pure raw sienna, so it's more on the golden side. And then the medium brown is the burnt sienna, and the darkest brown is a mixture of burnt sienna plus a bit of indigo so that I could get a very rich dark brown. But essentially, I want to make sure that I have a lighter brown, a medium brown, and a darker brown so that I can make sure that I'm going to be able to create a variety of different brown values. And I can also ensure that I have a nice play with color temperature in these browns as well. So as you can see, I am still making sure that my color mixtures that I'm preparing for myself on my color mixing palette are nice and juicy. They have a good amount of water in them, but they also have a good amount of paint in them, so that if at any point in my painting process I want to create a bridge color between a couple of these, I can just pull out a little bit of each color into a separate well on my color mixing palette and create something in between. But I can also lighten any color that I need to make more transparent along the way by just pulling out a little bit of that color mixture into one of my clean wells on my color mixing palette and adding a little bit of water into that. Also, by knowing which colors you're going to be using in different sections of your painting, as well as how you're going to be developing different values throughout each area, you're going to know which colors to reach out for if any of your color mixtures run out. All right, and finally, I am going to be creating my very dark gray, almost black looking color that I'm going to be using for my area of cast shadow and occlusion shadow under the avocado. And to create this color, I am going to be mixing together my burnt sienna with my indigo. Now, I would highly recommend experimenting with the ratios of these two colors, whatever dark blue it is that you decide to use and whatever brown it is that you decide to use, because if you have more brown than blue in your color mixture, it's probably going to look like a dark brown. And if you have more blue than brown in your color mixture, it's probably going to look like a dark blue. And you want something that's in between. You want this color to look almost black when it's at its most saturated, and you want it to look like a lighter gray when it's in a more watered down state. Before getting started with my painting process, I also prepare a bit of pure Indian yellow with a little bit of water in it on my color mixing palette. Okay, so with our color mixtures ready, it is time to change our water so that we can get started with our painting process. Oftentimes, once I'm done with creating my different color mixtures that I'm gonna get started with, my water is pretty murky and I want to make sure that it's nice and clean, especially because I like getting started with wet on wet, which means I want to pre-wet sections of my paper with clean water before dropping in my color. And that's exactly what I am doing right now. I am using my size 6 round brush to basically paint in clean water into the entirety of the avocado halves. So I am taking my time with this process. I want to make sure that I arrive at a nice even sheen and glistening before starting to drop in my color. I go over everything at least 3 to 4 times so that I can make sure that no section of this pre-wetted area dries too fast. All right, so with that nice even glistening of water on my avocado halves, I am now starting to paint in my first color, which is going to be the Indian yellow. So this is my pure Indian yellow with a bit of water in it that I prepared for myself at the end of my creation of my different color mixtures. And what I am doing with this bright yellow is I am basically creating a type of underpainting so that I can have this bright yellow glow coming from underneath the green layers that I'm going to be placing on top. I drop in only a bit of yellow at a time, and then once I feel I've placed enough color on my paper, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush and move that color around a bit just to make sure that my layer of yellow is very light and transparent. I even use the bristles of my paintbrush as a sort of absorbent sponge here and there to lift up some excess color from my paper. Once I was happy with my yellow underpainting, I allowed everything to dry completely. It's super important that in between our layers, everything completely dries. And if you want to, you can help yourself with a blow dryer to speed up the drying process. So it's time to get started with our lightest green, and we're gonna make our way incrementally towards the darkest green. So what I am doing right here, still using my size 6 round brush, and you can feel free to use whichever brush you're most comfortable with. And I am going in with my lightest green in a pretty translucent state. This is pretty watered down. I tested out my color mixture on my scrap piece of watercolor paper before going in order to ensure that I'm going in pretty light and transparent initially. And instead of trying to cover up the entirety of this section of the avocado with a uniform, even green, what I am doing is making sure that even at this point, I'm developing a variety of values and translucencies with my greens. And as you can see, I've even left certain little sections in which that underpainting, that yellow, is shining through completely unpainted. Notice how I'm going over everything quite a few times with a very small amount of paint in my paintbrush, oftentimes just with a bit of water that I brought out from my container. And this is to ensure that this initial layer of lightest green is still going to be wet by the time I start dropping in my second green along the edges of that avocado, which I notice in the reference photo are darker. I want that next layer of green to bleed and merge softly into that previous lighter green. And in order for that to happen organically, that initial layer has to be wet still. If you paint in that initial lightest green very quickly, then most likely than not, that merging, that wet on wet effect that is created when you drop in the next green, it's not going to happen because that lighter green layer is going to start to dry. It's going to be dry along some places. All right, so as you can see, I've already started to develop a nice range of values and translucencies in that left half of the avocado. I have some sections in which that yellow, that underpainting is shining through completely, which could be referred to as the lightest lights in this area. Then I have some sections in which that green looks very light and translucent, and other sections, especially along the edges and the cast shadow created by the seed of the avocado, in which I've already started to develop darker green midtones. It was time to allow that to dry completely, and I am now pretty much doing exactly the same thing on the other half of the avocado. Now, the left half of the avocado is the one with the seed in it. And this new half that I am painting in right now is the one that is going to have that concave section because it doesn't have that seed. So I am actually doing more work with the greens inside of this section. It's especially important when we are thinking of making some sections of something look like they are going inward or outward, that you pay attention to the values that you see in your reference photo or whatever it is that you have in front of you in real life. Pay attention to those values, because if you don't develop those values accordingly, then you're not going to be able to develop that sensation of something being concave or convex or something going in or going out. It's all about those values. Here you can see me do a little bit of lifting once again, using my clean and only slightly damp paintbrush bristles. And once again, this is to ensure that I am always thinking of creating a sense of dimension and not darkening areas too much that don't need darkening. All right, so once I was happy with the variety of green values and translucencies that I developed in that right half of the avocado, it was time to switch on over to my size 5 round brush. So this one is a tad bit smaller than the one that I was using previously because I am going to be working in a smaller area. It is time to get started with painting in the seed. By this point, the entire green portion of the left half of the avocado is completely dry, and that is super important because if it weren't dry, then I would risk these browns that I am painting in to merge into those greens. So make sure that those greens are completely dry if you don't want that to happen. Now, to paint in the seed, I am using the same ideas, basically going through the same method that I was using when I painted in the greens. So initially, I went in with the lightest brown, the lightest of the group that I had prepared for myself, in a semi-translucent state. So it was a pretty watered down light brown. I kept some areas of highlights protected that I didn't even wet initially with that first layer of lightest brown because I wanted to keep those areas as highlights. So these are sections in which that yellow underpainting is shining through completely and they look almost white, like highlights. So I created that initial layer of lightest translucent brown, and with that initial lightest layer of brown in and still wet, I started dropping in my medium brown, which was my burnt sienna with some water in it, only into certain sections that I wanted to darken within that. And then with that medium brown in there, still wet, I dropped in my darkest brown only into areas that I wanted to push those darkest darks in more, according to what I was seeing in the reference photo. The darkest brown in this case was the one created with the burnt sienna plus a bit of indigo in it. My different browns are merging together beautifully because I am working relatively fast and I am making sure to drop in the next color while that previous layer is still wet. You can imagine that if I had to create my color mixtures while I was painting, I could risk that initial layer of paint or that previous layer of paint drying on me, and then that next color not really merging or creating that wet on wet effect on that previous layer. So having those color mixtures ready for us is super, super helpful if we want those wet on wet transitions to happen. All right, so I was pretty happy with the variety of browns and the highlights and the darkest darks that I developed in that seed, and it was time to allow that to dry completely. So using my size 6 round brush, what I am doing right here is I am using clean water or relatively clean water to pre-wet the entire cast shadow area right underneath and to the right of the avocados. I am going to be dropping in my gray that I'm going to be using to paint in the cast shadow on pre-wetted paper once again, so that I can have that paint dissipate outwards organically. Another benefit that I've found in terms of pre-wetting my paper before dropping in my color is that I find I have more time to work in that section. So if I want to continue dropping in more color to darken certain areas, or even to gently and minimally move that paint around and maybe help out those gradients expand further or whatever it is, I have more time to do that versus painting on paper that is completely dry, because that paint starts drying immediately after you place it on your paper when your paper is completely dry. When you would take time to do your pre-wetting, you have a little bit more working time. With the cast shadow painted in, it was time to allow that to dry and to get to work on the outer edges of the avocado halves. I first started by painting in a little brown shape and a little very dark shape that I perceive in these avocados before getting started with actually painting in the thick, rugged skin. Now, I want to show you the technique that I use to describe that thick, irregular, rugged outer skin in a relatively easy, loose, and quick way. I would highly recommend practicing this technique on a scrap piece of watercolor paper before going into your painting. I am using a size 2 round brush for this, and we're going to be using the same very dark gray, almost black looking color mixture that we use to paint in the cast shadow area. So I loaded up my size 2 round brush with some of that very dark gray color mixture. And right here I am practicing this in a more horizontal, linear kind of way, but it's the same thing that you're going to be doing. It's just that you're going to be following that outer edge of that avocado, right? So it's going to be slightly more curved. But essentially all this technique is you are moving your paintbrush laterally or in a curved way, following that outer edge of the avocado shape, while you're simultaneously pressing down the bristles of your paintbrush to different degrees. So essentially you're creating elongated, abstract little shapes. In some sections of those shapes, you're just barely touching the tip of your paintbrush, and in others, you're pressing down the belly of your paintbrush a little bit more. And this creates the illusion of certain sections of those elongated shapes being thinner or more narrow, and other sections of those elongated shapes being thicker and wider. And that creates the illusion of that rugged, irregular outer skin. That's all it is. Because the outer skin of avocados tend to have a very dark local value, I allow myself to go in with this very dark color mixture in a relatively saturated state. It's not incredibly dry that I just arrive at an even value all throughout, but I do allow myself to go in with this dark gray in a pretty saturated state. And as that paint load starts running out from my paintbrush bristles, naturally the paint starts looking more and more transparent in some sections, which helps me create at least somewhat of a variety of values and translucencies even in the outer skin. I continue approaching painting in the outer skin in sections. You can see how certain sections of these little elongated abstract shapes are not even touching, they're not even connecting in some sections. Okay, so right there, I'm just darkening some little tiny brown sections before moving on to the very last phase of this painting process, which is pushing darkest green areas within the green sections of these avocado halves. So first and foremost, I created a very dark green color mixture. So what I did was I added some sap green into my dark gray color mixture. So remember that color mixture that we were using for the cast shadow area and the outer skin? I added sap green into that. So essentially, that dark green color mixture is a mixture of burnt sienna plus indigo plus sap green. So you can see how dark and rich that green is. Personally, I decide to do this part of the process with my size 5 round brush, and you can see me go in and start painting in those very dark abstract shapes created by the darkest green values. Of course, I am constantly looking at my reference photo and getting clues from my reference photo as to where darkest dark areas should be developed. I cannot start working from imagination or start randomly placing this dark green, because if I do, most likely than not, my painting is not going to look very realistic or believable at the end. And I might even end up with shadows and highlights that look inconsistent, and that will not lead to a very believable look. So it's so important that you consistently look at your reference photo or whatever you're working with in real life that you can reach out and touch, and observe where you should be pushing those darker value areas. Now, because I am painting on dry paper, you can see how I'm left with harsh, defined looking edges around the abstract shapes that I am painting in. And so what I do to go back in and soften and even do some lifting is, after I've placed some amount of paint on my paper in those areas that I want to darken, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in with a clean and only slightly damp paintbrush, run my bristles of my paintbrush along the edges that I want to soften. That helps create nice soft transitions from darker green values into lighter green values. And gets rid of that sharp defined edge. Likewise, I also do a little bit of pulling and lifting in those dark green shapes to get some sections of those shapes lighter and more translucent, because what happens, especially when you move on to using very dark colors like this one that we're ending the painting process with, is that it's even easier to create flatness and heaviness. So we have to be careful that we are A, just darkening areas that we're looking to darken more, and B, you can consider using the pulling, lifting, and that kind of technique to make certain sections of these abstract darker shapes more transparent, so that they can integrate better into lighter value areas and also have more dimension throughout them. And we can ensure that we're not going to arrive at a look that is too heavy and flat. Whatever techniques you decide to use, whether it's pulling, lifting, or softening of those dark green shapes or edges in some way, shape, or form, make sure that you go in gently and minimally. The less moving around of that paint that you do once it's been placed on your paper, the better and the fresher the outcome you're gonna have. All right, so this is just around the point that I decide to stop because I can start overworking things very, very easily. And so I decided to go ahead and leave it at that before I start overworking things. I'm pretty happy with the overall sensation of 3D form developed. And we are done with today's watercolor avocado study. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you found some helpful nuggets in it, that you found it inspiring, and if you did, pretty please, I'd super appreciate it if you give this video a thumbs up and share with family or friends who you think would find it helpful as well. That really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and allows others to get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next week for another video, and keep on creating. Bye guys!